Today we have the pleasure to introduce Nicolas Negroponte. Nicolas is an architect by education, and he is one of the, let's say, heroes of the digital age. I wrote in the Metapolis dictionary that Media Lab was for the information age what Bauhaus was for the industrial times. So there are some moments in the history that there are some people that are able to create an environment where the future is invented. This happened in the 20s in Germany with the Bauhaus, where many people came in from design, architecture, arts, etc. They were designing from a spoon to urbanists. And we were lucky that at MIT, around the year 85, was created the Media Lab. Nicolas was able to put together people coming from many different fields, from art, technology, fabrication, physicists, computer scientists, etc. And in fact, they had a vision about how to put together, how to create something new out of computation, telecommunications, and the publishing world. This is what we discovered some years later as the World Wide Web, but in the lab they were doing many, many things that for us was very inspirational. In fact, with Manuel, we created the Institute and the Master Program 12 or 13 years ago, and basically we created following this idea that we could invent the future. The good news is that I think that the future is nearby, so we are looking, we smell the future. And we had a great opportunity that Nicolas is here, and we are more than happy to introduce him tonight. Thank you for coming, Nicolas.
I'm going to hope this works by leaving it in my pocket so that I don't lose my hands. I'm sorry, I can't speak Spanish, but I can speak English slowly. And I think everybody speaks English pretty fluently anyway. For those of you who are students here, I studied architecture and never practiced. But it was the best education I ever had. And if I had to do it all over again, I'd study architecture. And I think that what's happening in the world today is kind of interesting, because design school in general is the future and business school is the past. And it used to be that, especially in art schools, parents were so unhappy when their children went to art school. It was kind of like a failure. Why weren't they going to go to business school? And I would see a much better world as the world becomes more interested and sensitive to and able to design. So the connection between what you do and what I do is really a point of view. And what I will show you is mostly what I'm doing right now, but I am happy in questions or interrupt, tell you about things that had to do with the Media Lab. Media Lab was in the right place at the right time with the right people. So a lot of things happened historically. It wasn't just me. But after running the Media Lab for 20 or 25 years, depending how you count, I thought it was my turn to do something. Because when you run something like the Media Lab, your job is a little bit like a civil servant. You have to make it possible for others to be creative and get tenure and come in as students and do good theses. And at the peak, there were about 500 people working at the Media Lab. So it was a very big operation. So once I stopped doing that, or at least we brought in a new director, I decided that what I would do was try and change the world in a very specific way, and that was to adopt the concept of every child having a connected laptop. And this was almost 10 years ago. And the reason at the time that it couldn't happen was that, believe it or not, laptops were much too expensive. Everything else that was either expensive or not plentifully available, you could look at and you could predict with great certainty that the costs of connectivity would go down, the reach of cell phones would increase, the amount of power the world would have, whether it's locally generated or part of a grid, would increase. But there was no commercial reason for the cost of laptops to go down. Now, as just a parenthesis, I just want to say that when I wake up in the morning, I ask myself one question. And that question is, will normal market forces do what I'm doing today? And if the answer is yes, stop. In other words, don't do it. If normal market forces are going to do it, don't do it. At least for me. Let normal market forces do it. But there's some things normal market forces don't do. And one of them, 10 years ago, was that normal market forces had no interest in bringing the cost of a laptop down to $100. There was no benefit. Worse, there was this little war, maybe you don't want to call it a war, but a little escalation going on between Intel and Microsoft. So every time Intel made a faster processor, Microsoft used more of it. And then Intel made a faster processor and Microsoft used more of it. And it was like a joke. For 20 years, it wasn't a funny joke, but it was real, that you got faster and faster processors, and actually, in many ways, laptops got slower. It takes much longer to turn one on, turn it off, shut it down than it ever used to before. So in this escalation, what was held constant was the cost of the laptop was $1,000 roughly, 800 euros, whatever. But this little war was going on. So I said, let's make one for $100 and connect every child in the world, which was a little ridiculous, but the credibility of MIT, the people I knew, the places that it was sort of announced, it got a lot of attention. And for the next 8 years, it grew. There are about 3 million of these. It was about $1 billion project. And a number of countries did it, a number of countries didn't. I can tell you stories for hours. But at the end of this, and it's not the end, it's still continuing, I looked back and I said to myself, now what? Okay, so it's sort of Negroponte 3.0. What do you do? I mean, now it's... And I decided that I would do what I'm going to show you here, and that is there are 100 million children who don't go to school. Now, just again, parenthetically, that's a very interesting number because how do you count it? Who's counted? So if a child is 5 years old today and does not go to school, you obviously count that child. If the child is 6 next year, do you still count the child? Yes, of course. 7, yes. 8, yes. So it's a number that includes a window. You don't count a 25-year-old, but do you count a 16-year-old? So you figure out who you count, and then I'll tell you what the number is. And the number is between 60 and 100 million, depending how you count kids. And most of those children don't go to school because there isn't one. It's not because they're working in the field or their parents want them to be laborers. It's because there isn't a school. And when I say most, again, it doesn't matter if it's 30 million or 35 million, it's still a big number. It's probably actually closer to 45 million. So if they don't go to school, what happens? And the answer is they teach themselves. Kids become the teachers. And can you do that with technology? You don't necessarily use remote distance learning because you can't get the bandwidth into the village. You don't train lots of teachers and try to send them to the villages, even if that's in the long run a nice thing to do or the right thing to do. You just can't do it fast enough. So we decided we'd run an experiment. What would be the thing you wanted to prove that a child could do on his or her own? And the answer is reading. And the reason the answer is reading is because if you can learn to read, you can read to learn. There's a cusp. There's a little point of inflection there. Most of you arrived at that point at about the age 7 or 8. That tends to be, and that number, age 6, 7, 8, where you go from learning to read to reading to learn, has to do with the brain. It's not to do with schools or teachers or classrooms. It has to do with how the brain learns to read. Now, our brains have evolved for roughly 1 million years, whatever number you want to pick. And over that 1 million years, our brain knows how to talk. You can take any child from any place in the world and drop that child in Barcelona. So you take a 5-year-old from the jungles, from the deserts, rich, poor, you name the country, and that child will speak Catalan or Spanish in 8 months, 10 months. We know that. You did, I did, we all did. You have children or nieces or nephews or grandchildren. We know that the brain does that. Unfortunately, reading and writing is only 3,500 years old, plus or minus. And the brain doesn't know how to do it. The brain does not naturally read. So what you've got to do is a little bit of there has to be some teaching and some learning that is quite explicit. You can't just drop a child suddenly in a country called reading or words and so on and have that child absorb it. But the question is, how close can you come? In other words, could you do a lot less and have children learn amongst themselves? And if you could do that, could you do it quickly? Could you do it in less than 3 years for every child on the planet? So that's what this is about. Let me see if I can figure out what key to push here to advance this. Does that do it? Yeah. That is the best picture I have. It may be a little dark, and it's just as a picture, but this is the experiment I'm going to show you. It's in 2 villages, this is one of them, in Ethiopia. And these are villages that have never seen a word. I've got to be a little careful because we found recently on some of the clothing labels on some of the clothing children were wearing. So they had seen at least the words on the label. But there are no street signs, no printed matter, no paper, no magazines, no bottles with labels on them, no literate adults, no telephone, no television, no nothing. So I'll give, by way of background, and let me just sort of, these were slides I prepared for this GSM meeting, is separate quickly, and you'll see this will go back to reading in a moment, innovation from invention, because one of the things that you're doing here, at least a little bit I saw, is you're inventing. You're inventing and discovering things, and don't forget that. Because again, and it's not as if I'm anti-business school, but when you go to business schools and people invent a business model to take cosmetic samples and put them in a box and sell a subscription and then sell back to the manufacturer information about the cosmetics, that's a wonderful business model. But you know, it's cosmetics. It's not, there's no invention or discovery really in a lot of the new business models. And I also want to make some distinction, again, for the people that I spoke to yesterday. that connectivity matters. And the audience that I spoke to yesterday, quite frankly, became very exercised and very nervous when I told them that I thought that connectivity was a human right and should be free. And they don't think of it that way. They think it should be inexpensive and a self-supporting business. And the difference between free and a human right and a self-supporting business is a very fundamental one. It's interesting that roads are free, but cars cost something. Schools should be, primary schools, my opinion, it's a civic responsibility, but people still build them. People build hospitals, and still there's primary medicine and so on. So it's not that there aren't business models, but it's what is a civic right, and I think connectivity is one of them. And then the last word side that I'm going to use is this one. And there's so much discussion about education and so little discussion about learning. It's kind of extraordinary, actually. And if you ask somebody to separate the two in their minds, then they start to think of it a little bit differently, because we all engaged in we know what learning is long before you get to school. And a lot of education is a little bit analogous to, let's say, banking. Well, banking, you can't have a strong economy without a good banking system, but economics is more fundamental, and likewise learning. So that's what the experiment's going to be about, and I'll show you, I'm just going to skip that and show you just what led up to this work. This reason I show this slide is because there are many people in the field of learning and development and computers who are newcomers to it. This was an experiment that we were running, or it really was an experiment, in 1982, while the Media Lab was just a concept. I had proposed the concept for the Media Lab, and then we built a building, and literally there was a construction period that happened from 1982 to 1984, and during those 2 years, I engaged in this other work where we brought computers, in this case, to Senegal, Pakistan, and Colombia, with the 3 countries, way ahead of its time. We were connected to what was now, or what is now called the internet. At the time it wasn't, but the kids weren't. But what we learned from these small experiments in 1982 is that this child, who spoke neither French nor English, played that keyboard like a piano. There was no difference between this child's behavior and the behavior of kids in the rich suburbs of New York and Boston and Paris and London. So fast forward 20 years almost, and I became involved for long, complicated, personal, circumstantial reasons in building a school in Cambodia, in a village that, guess what, had no electricity, no telephone, no anything. And in this village, the average income was $42 a year, literally a year. So I built the physical school, and you can see a satellite dish in the background, and literally bought, this was in the early days of eBay, bought laptops on eBay and sent them to Cambodia. And these kids, who were, again, didn't have electricity except for the generator in the school, were connected very happily to the internet at home, in their homes. And the parents liked it because it was the brightest light source in the house. So they liked it for a metaphorical, or actually a real reason, and I thought the metaphorical one was pretty important. And then from this photograph, really, from this experience, I decided to do the so-called $100 laptop project. And so that was the origins, and I made a decision very early on that it should be a non-profit, that all my friends, every single friend I had, and all my colleagues at the Harvard Business School, and places like that said, Nicholas, make a profit-making company, become very rich, and give away the money. And I said, no, the reason you shouldn't do that, and always think about this when you ask yourself that question, is there's a difference between a mission and a market. They're very different. And when you wake up in the morning and you have a mission, that's one thing. If you have a market, then you have customers, you have other fiduciary responsibilities, you have shareholders, you have investors, you have all sorts of things that you have to optimize in parallel, and I'm not criticizing it. Be an entrepreneur, get very rich, but always understand the difference. One of the differences is you can have partners that you can't have otherwise, and I had the great fortune of having this man as a partner in the beginning to launch the laptop. And Kofi Annan was extraordinary. I'll show you the first one we made. We announced this together in Tunis in November of 2005. And it's a cute picture. We made real engineering prototypes. And people who saw this picture still to this day remember one thing about this picture. And it's the pencil yellow crank. Everybody remembers the crank. And it was important because when you looked at the picture, you saw, well, this is kind of a toy, but it's a laptop, and then I guess it generates its own energy and so on. It turns out it's actually a very stupid idea to put a crank on a laptop, but it was the right thing to launch. It was the right picture. And because this was a world sort of conference, a little bit like the GSM is right now, there were lots and lots of cameras. I mean, literally in the room there must have been 200 TV stations with their little cameras on, and everybody in the audience had a little thing writing notes, and so it was really a very large press conference. And somebody from the audience yells out, Kofi Annan and Nicholas Negroponte, crank your computers. So we shut the laptops, and we on each side, and we start cranking our laptops. And Kofi Annan's handle comes off in his hand. These are engineering prototypes. So as he's cranking, the handle comes off. And guess what he does? He doesn't blink. He just keeps moving his hand in exactly the right way, as if nothing had happened. The little thing was sticking upright. Versus most people would go, my handle broke or something. He just kept going and looking at the cameras and smiling, and nobody knew his handle had broken. I think to this day, nobody knew that it had actually fallen off. Well, that's not what we built. We built this, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it became a tablet. It was all sorts of technology in it. And of the 3 million, most went to Peru. About 800,000 went to Peru. Uruguay did every child in the country. Quite a few went to Africa. About 40 countries and 25 languages. And when I look at a picture like that, and I just wonder, that girl is going to grow up a little bit differently than she would have otherwise grown up. And what she's growing up with is kind of a passion, or how many children that age are so engaged with what they're doing, particularly at school? So there are a few more of these, and they're quite lovely pictures. A lot of kids, I can't tell you the exact number, but I think it's over 50,000 and maybe as high as 100,000 children in Peru are teaching their parents how to read and write. I don't have a better story. And if that doesn't put goosebumps on your goosebumps, I don't have much else to tell you. But these are charming pictures, and now let me get on to my story. Oh, except maybe I'll tell you one thing about this picture. This man had never, this is in India, this man had never seen or used a computer. His classroom, all the kids were lined up in perfect rows, and the discipline was such that he had a little whip, and asked a question, and you'd hear a swat, you know, if the answer was wrong. So these kids were kind of petrified and sitting in perfect lines, and this is the way he teaches now. And the kids run to school, and the parents are hanging in the windows, and they take the, you know, their laptops home. It's just completely transformational to the life of the village. The kids are kind of now connected. They tell their parents what the Chicago wholesale exchange for tomatoes is this week. And they, I mean, it's just a very, very different life. And again, we can talk. So we changed it to the tablet. We built a tablet, not very interesting. Can talk about that afterwards if you want to. But these are the pictures I want to end with. And this is what I was saying in the beginning, the 100 million kids who don't go to school. In this village, everybody does the same thing, and that is they get water. That's all they do all day, is look for and get and carry water. So what we did, there were two villages. That was one, and this is the other, and they're both in Ethiopia. This is in the north. It's a beautiful picture and a beautiful scenery, but they've got absolutely nothing. And they can walk down and fish, and that's about the limit. This is the best house in town, and these are the kids using the tablets. Now, what did we do? We dropped the tablets off in the village in closed boxes with no instructions and no human. Now, the tablets are hot, and by that I mean when you turn it on, it records what time. When you touch something, it records what you've touched, if it's multiple fingers. So it tracks exactly how they're being used. And for those of you who are scientists in the room, especially American scientists, you know there's something called the IRB, which concerns itself with the use of human subjects, and all of that was cleared and passed, and everybody from the president right down to the chief of the town realized this was an experiment. We were monitoring and looking at the behavior of the children. So what happened? We dropped off in this village 25 tablets. Within 2.5 minutes, a child figured out how to turn on the first tablet, which included, by the way, figuring out you should open the box versus play with the boxes. I mean, they opened the box, they got the never seen an on-off switch, never seen a cell phone, never seen a computer display, but finally, you know, and these, by the way, are Motorola tablets, and they're very hard to turn on. It's not easy. So 2.5 minutes, they turned it on. Within 5 days, they were using 50 apps per child per day, 50 apps per child per day. Within 2 weeks, they were singing ABC songs, and within 5 months, they hacked Android. Okay, that's pretty extraordinary, and I'm dead serious, and we know which kid did it, when, and so on and so forth. And perhaps the best picture is, well, these are good pictures too, but there's the best picture. That's the best picture I have. And the reason it's so good is that the kid on the right has sort of named himself teacher. Though he's sort of looking a little bit bored. But look at the kid on the left. Now they all have tablets, but the one on the left is using the other kids. Okay, talk about collaborative learning. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. Now, this weekend, I don't want you to think that I'm giving you old news, I had a team in that village testing whether the kids could read. Now, the reading they did, and I'm sorry I don't have the videos to show you, was quite extraordinary because they could read words and pronounce them really well. And they sounded like very good English because they've been hearing these on movies and sort of seeing them in cartoons and in games. But it's only been, you know, 10 months in one village and 8 months in the other. So they're not yet doing what's called deep reading, but they're showing a lot of promise. It looks very good. Now, If it happens, then the thing is, what's next? In other words, what do you, I mean, you don't run another experiment. You have to really do something. Now, the truth is I don't have the answer, but I know it's not another pilot project. It's not something that you test. And somebody said that to me today, and I forget. I jumped down his throat. Well, it was sometime in the recent, somebody, I guess it was the president of the Ukraine, said, I would like to run a pilot project in my country. And I said, Mr. President, do you pilot electricity in your country? I mean, you don't need to pilot anything anymore. You don't pilot cell phones. You don't pilot electricity. You don't need to pilot tablets and learning. You just need to do it. I don't know if, oh yes, what happened? What happened was about 3 months ago, maybe it's a little less or a little more, I just told the story. We published in a magazine, big mistake, we published the names of the 2 villages. God, I wish we hadn't. When we published the names of the villages, you just go to Google Maps, you find out where they are, and they sent helicopters in, and they sent reporters in, and so now the kids give press conferences. Okay, and this was a press conference that the kids were giving to show the reporter that they could spell words and so on. So the experiment's a little bit contaminated, but it's widely known. And I think that's, no, there's one last slide. Last slide is in case you have a question. That's my real email address, so don't abuse it. That's real, that's not fake. So if you use it, please use it with short message and an important question. But I'd like to leave the rest of the time for questions and answers, but only to say, sort of in closing, that the United Nations has this so-called Millennium Goal for 100% literacy and children going to school, which comes due, the goal is the end of 2015. And there's no way in hell they're going to make it unless they do this. And there's no postponing, okay? This has to happen in the next few months. Somebody has to decide to do it. Now the problem is it costs $12 billion. And that sounds outrageous. 12 billion is a lot of money. But it's 6 days of war in Afghanistan. I mean, it depends how you think about it. So it's not an impossible number. And it's something one could do. And if you look at it from the other point of view, not the total cost, it's 10 cents per child per week to achieve 100% literacy in the world. So that's my story. Thank you, and please welcome. Absolutely. Whatever questions can be even unrelated. Yes?
How much focus was on the content itself? Because getting the devices out is one thing.
Yeah. I'll repeat the question because briefly, the question is how much of this depends, is there another mic? How much of it depends on the content? Because I think you could imagine getting them out would be...
And how do you ensure consistency with kids around the world as it comes to literacy, making sure that they're learning at a certain standard? So were you also pushing a certain content platform out?
Okay. Question is, were we pushing a content platform and a learning standard? First of all, and this makes me very vulnerable, but I define literacy as learning to read and write English. And pause for a second, it's a big thing. The developing countries want that. When you go to most countries, they would love to have the kids learn to read and write English first. And in some countries, they already do. In Sierra Leone, for example, small country, kids learn to read and write English in first grade, even though they don't speak it in the villages. So yes, that content platform of being English. We don't have, quote, software or a software suite. What we have is about 500, and there should be a lot more, but about 500 apps on the tablet that fall in 5 categories. They're kids' books, whatever, hundreds of them, where it's just a children's book with words, and you flip the pages, and it reads the words, and it's, you know, it's analogous to when your parents read you a story at night. They're movies, children's movies, subtitled in as many places as possible, so you hear the sounds, and if you can read some words, you see them. Cartoons subtitled, games, conspicuously word games, letter games, phonetic games, and so on. Some of them are silly. We don't write them, obviously. We sort of curate them, but to be honest with you, it's pretty mediocre stuff, but there's lots of it. And then the 5th category, which some kids, I'm told, are starting to use, is some simple programming languages for the kids. So that's what's out there. The standard, there is a way of, I think it's called level 3, to figure out whether a child has gotten to the cusp, and it's the same test. So you could do it. I think next week you'll hear of a prize, a $10 million prize that will be announced for the first people who can make that kind of stuff in a provable way, which would do this. And I think, you know, $10 million is a pretty big purse, and so a lot of people will try and win the prize, I believe. So there are things happening to do the content. We did not. You had a question, yes?
Yeah, could you maybe elaborate a little bit on how many tablets placed in the village and how they were shared and what kind of social basis whether children, for instance, left out, or were they started to come to themselves, or were shared?
I will answer not only that question, but sort of by extension other places where we've done, particularly the laptop. We picked villages that were purposely small, that didn't have more than 25 children, but had more than 10. We looked for villages with a child population, where child is defined from 5 to 15, where you don't want less than 10 because they can deflate. If you get 3 kids looking at a problem that they feel is too hard, they might give up. When you get a minimum of 10 kids looking at a problem, one of them always has some kind of crazy idea, and then someone else has a crazy, and so you need a minimum, and then you sort of want a maximum, because if you have more than 25 kids in the village, you start to get a population that at least justifies having a school nearby. And in my opinion, a bad school is sometimes worse than no school. So that was the window. So then, because of that, we could have 1 tablet per child, and nobody was left out. And we have some 4-year-olds in that village who feel left out, and then we have some 19-year-olds who feel left out, but that has not caused, they sort of share, and, you know, but the kids who own them, own them. Well, it's a good question. The truth is, since none of us are there, but the cameras are on. You see, when you have a tablet and the camera takes a picture of you, we know who you are. Okay, so we can look at who's using the tablet at every instant. So if an older brother takes a tablet, in theory, to look at pornography, we could see the picture of the older brother, but in this case, these tablets aren't connected anyway. It's all resident on the tablet. So there hasn't been too much of it. But in the laptop project, there has been much more. And there, the worry that people had in the beginning was a little bit different. It was that when you have a very poor family and the parent takes the laptop and sells it on the black market, and what was to stop that from happening? And it turned out, in the case of the laptop, it didn't happen, partly because there was no secondary market. But there's another thing that is, I think, quite encouraging, and that is even in these villages where the parents aren't literate, they understand, they believe, maybe is the right way to say it, they believe that education will advantage their children. I don't know where they get that belief from, but they believe it. And that helps any kind of business of stealing or abusing, and there's been, in general, much more sharing than you'd expect. But this sample size is too small. The laptop is much better thing to look at, and out of almost 3 million, I think we had 50 stolen, or it's a number under 100. Yes?
So now it's been some 5 years since
Yes.
the first laptops were deployed.
Yeah.
I can imagine it's have grown up. What happened to those laptops? Are they still using the laptop? Is there a second generation of kids growing up using these original laptops?
The answer is that the kids keep the laptops, and we make more generations, and each time there's a new cohort of students who go to school, the country buys them new laptops. So there hasn't been a recycling of laptops. Plus, the oldest ones now are 5 years old, and they should sort of be dead, but they're not. They still live on, and people use them for other things. But we try to encourage, you know, each time there's a new, each year there's, if you will, an incoming number of laptops for the village or for the country. Now, after 5 years, which is what we thought the life expectancy should be, then, you know, the kids should get a new one. So the economics are such that at this point, you really have each year to not only replenish 1/5 if they, you know, bringing in the new fifth, but you should also replace 1/5. So you really are into the 2/5, which is a pretty big number in terms of both replacement and newcomers.
Is that a replacement because of battery life?
Replacement is really, they're very good for abuse, but it tends to be more physical abuse. The battery life is important, you're absolutely right. And that, of course, is the number of charges and discharges. So yes, you can get the battery life, but the replacements aren't that expensive. Replacements are about $8 or $9. So you could replace the battery. But physical abuse or age, wearing, sort of, it's like old clothes. I mean, that almost no laptop has ever been designed for 5-year life expectancy. So it's already doing pretty good. And there are lots of market reasons why you don't want to have a 5-year life expectancy. So it's doing pretty good, but your point is a good one. You have to replace as well as fill in, bring in the new ones. Yes?
Do you adjust somehow the tablets for the place that you would bring? For example, if it's in Africa, maybe applications or history or...
I'm having trouble hearing.
Do you adjust somehow tablets to the places where you bring them? History or is it more general?
Okay, so I think your question is, do you change the content for country to country? And the answer is yes, but the country doesn't. The country does it because in the case of the laptops, we dealt with the country, and then the country puts the software on it that is indigenous to their country. Now, we have lots of things that were used in every country, But if you looked at the countries, I'll compare Peru to Ethiopia. In Peru, the person running the project, and it turns out that in Spanish you have lots of literature, lots of children's books, and so it was very book-oriented. In Uruguay, different than Peru, all the laptops were connected, so it was very internet-oriented. In Ethiopia, there were neither books nor internet, and so they ended up being very programming language-oriented. And so it just changed from country to country, not because we thought that Ethiopia should program and Peru should read books and Uruguay should be on the internet, but that's just how the cards fell and how the country absorbed it. So it changed. What we tried to do, which is very different than my answer to the first question where we said reading and writing is in English, in the laptop project we did it in local language. So every laptop is, if you will, bilingual in the sense that it has local language plus English, and the keyboard has the local language. So if it's Urdu or, you know, Farsi or American Ethiopia, you have different fonts on the keyboard, and so you will find these keyboards that you've seen that have the Latin alphabet and some other alphabet on each key. So we did try to make it localized. And in one case, actually, in Ethiopia, nobody had ever really standardized the Ethiopian keyboard. So we found ourselves accidentally involved with where are the keys, which I certainly never expected to be involved with, but there was, in some cases, one had to even design the keyboard. Yes?
Did you find a lot of differences, and so were they between all the laptops that had internet connection and those that didn't, the way that the children used it?
Yeah. The question is, did we find differences either being connected, not connected, countries? The biggest differences to me were the quality of execution in the country, which usually depended on a particular person. You found somebody in the country who had enough personal energy to do it and make a commitment to do it, and enough political credibility so that he or she could pick up the phone and call the minister or the president or something. And I think the poster child, the best one that happened, was in fact Uruguay. In other places, it didn't do quite as well because it might have been a political, you know, a campaign speech that some incumbent, or not incumbent, but some sort of newly elected head of state was sort of campaigning on, then gets into office, and then the Minister of Education's told to do it, and then there's a new political issue, and it sort of devolves. So you get, so it's not so much that the kids in Uruguay are smarter than the kids in Ethiopia, it's really the execution and how it's done. And I can't tell you how many times, and this was the biggest surprise, I mean, I expected all sorts of things, but I never expected commercial interests to get in our way. And I just was astonished at how that would happen, and people would, you know, compete. I mean, the World Food Program, by analogy, doesn't compete with McDonald's. And we found ourselves in the startling position that we were suddenly competing with people like Microsoft and Intel and so on, which wasn't our intention at all. And that also made it very inconsistent from country to country. Yes?
Out of curiosity, can you elaborate about how did you react when Microsoft and Intel came with the school-made laptop? Why do you think that suddenly they had an interest in this market? And well, this wasn't a very nice game
well,
to be on.
you're the first phrase or your first sentence was, how did I react? And the answer is badly. In retrospect, if I could do it differently, I might have reacted a little bit differently in the beginning, but I was furious. In the end, it's wonderful that Intel's classmate came out, and I don't know, maybe they have 5 million or 8 million in the world today, and those are 8 million very lucky kids. You know, an Intel, I don't think is a particularly good laptop, but it's a lot better than nothing. So that's good, and maybe there would have been a way to collaborate better. I won't bore you with the details, but I think it's important in this case to have done it to get them to want to do it, even if they're doing the right thing for the wrong reason. They're doing it for market share. They're doing it because they don't want, let's say in the case of Microsoft, they don't want open source to get such a beachhead. Or in the case of Intel, they don't want non-Intel processors to get such a beachhead. So you could say that's not a noble reason, but you know, if they do the right thing and they get it out, I'm much more relaxed today than I was 6 years ago or 7 years ago. But there was a couple of other questions, but yes.
I have two questions. In the Mobile World Congress, some
Yeah.
companies, they announced that they are going to sell smartphones quite cheap in Africa.
They're going to sell, I'm sorry?
They want to sell a smartphone
Yes.
in a cheapest
Yep.
price in
Yep.
Africa.
Yep.
I want to know your opinion. And also, I have an idea, like, you are here and it's the Mobile World Congress, there are a lot of developers.
Yeah.
You say that your apps are not really good.
Well, they aren't. The ones on the tablet are terrible. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they are.
I understood they were a little bit mediocre.
They are. I'm the first to say it. I've never heard anybody say it to me, though. That's very good. I agree.
Okay, because I thought that maybe it would be a good idea also to imply more people in the idea, like developers around the world and not only for the MIT.
Oh, first of all, the tablets, out of 500 apps on the tablets, 1 comes from MIT. 499 come from all sorts of places, and I believe maybe as many as half of them are stolen. Okay. Come sue me. Okay. We just want to try it, and then if it works, I'm sure everybody want to put their apps on there. But you're correct. You need better apps, original question, and you need some way to get people to do it. And the apps are for, it's a very pedantic word, but for autodidactic learning, for children to learn by themselves or in groups. And generally software isn't made that way. Software is made making other assumptions about learning and children and so on and so forth. Your first question about the smartphones, that's wonderful. I mean, first of all, the cost of a handset should be very, very low. Now, I used to be on the board of directors of Motorola. I spent 15 years on the board. And I know what they go through and how they agonize and the margins and what goes into a cell phone and the costs and so on and so forth. But we are getting to a point where the cell phone itself is a commodity. And the smartphone can be commoditized too. And Android, which is really good in the sense that it's getting out there, is helping a great deal. The iPhone, by contrast, much as we love it and many people have it in the room, is just not the future. Android is the future. And, you know, as the world discovers that, and the reason Android is the future is because it's open. It's not because it's better, it's open. And open systems are always better than closed systems. So it'll be an open system, low-cost smartphone, and I love that. I think it's fantastic. Yeah. So, yes?
I wonder if there is any other long-term effect or impact that you observe besides learning to write or read?
The question is about long-term impacts. It hasn't quite been out there long enough but there was a very scientific study done on the kids that had laptops versus the kids that didn't, on reasoning, their ability to reason. And I don't even remember the tests and so on, but you know, but you can find it on the internet. The kids' ability to reason and do what is sometimes called critical thinking went up. And that's wonderful because test scores don't necessarily go up. And test scores are the wrong measure because they're measuring an old-fashioned kind of rote learning. And reasoning and creativity and critical thinking and all the stuff that we want for our kids is much more interesting. So let's do one more question, or do you have more time? I mean,
Are you able to measure any of that critical thinking and reasoning experiments on that versus these?
There are people who are doing that. We don't do much of it, and
They do it in partnership with you, or?
no, they don't do it in partnership with us because in some sense we want them to do it as a third-party objective and critical thing. And the Inter-American Development Bank has done some, the World Bank has done some, and various university professors. Part of the reason we don't is because I think that if you have to measure an effect, it wasn't worth doing. In other words, it should be so self-evident that, in other words, if you reduce, I was just talking before this meeting, if you reduce the need, let's say, to, I'm trying to use one that is so unquestionable but is also complex. Synthetic meat was my example before. You use 1% of the water and 0.5% of the land. If I could make synthetic meat, it seems to me I don't need to measure the effect of synthetic meat. Now, I might want to measure second-order effects and whether farmers suddenly go out of business and whether the cows aren't eating the grass and what it does to the methane and so on and so forth. But at least in terms of the meat, I don't have to measure it the same way we used to have to measure things to notice that we get this kind of difference, and so let's invest in it. So I tend, in fact, my whole life I've been a little allergic to measuring because I see a lot of people measuring small effects, and I sometimes wish if that energy were applied to making bigger effects, are we better off? But that's a bias, and it's, you know, and I applaud the people who do the measurement, but we haven't been doing much ourselves.
I think we have time for 2 questions.
2 more questions, okay. Yes?
I'm from Brazil. First, congratulations. I'm from Brazil, and there are so many times projects like taking antenna, electricity to a small village, and like creating a small school.
Yep.
There, so my curiosity actually, I'm not sure if it's a question. You can tell me more about the structure around this, because your project is really clearly focused on the laptops and these projects are more concentrated, more focused on in a school, in a library, in a physical space to learn where people can share that usually one computer.
Yep.
Okay. So I'm curious about the structure around this machine. Like how to maybe develop a project that's socially more complex in terms of, I don't know.
Well, let me take various parts of your question, and first of all, Lula was the first head of state to support this unequivocally during his first term as president. So I am very grateful to Brazil. And when he campaigned for the second term, he held the laptop in a sort of Che Guevara move with the laptop coming out of it. And I thought, oh my God, if he loses, we're in trouble. And he won, and we were still in trouble. And it didn't really happen in Brazil. But it didn't matter. It was still, for us, a rather important experience. But the sort of the next stage of your question, sometimes it's called frugal innovation. What's happening in the developing world where people do things that you started to describe in the middle of your question. And they're fascinating. I had a 12-year-old kid in my office recently from Sierra Leone. There's actually a pretty viral video of his project where he had made batteries out of garbage in Sierra Leone and won the prize, the so-called Maker Prize, and somebody paid for this kid to fly to New York, and then he came up to Boston and he spent some time at the Media Lab, and he came to my office and he showed me his battery, and he was with his colleague, and it was fantastic. But that's the worst way to make a battery. And they were focused on the battery and want to go back and build a factory in Sierra Leone. The way you make a battery is you pour chemicals into a factory with 0 people and you have batteries coming out the other end. It's the best kind of battery, reliable batteries, safe batteries, inexpensive batteries. You don't want people to make them by hand. And the reason I use that example is that the innovation is supreme, and that's what was so important. But very often people look at the battery, metaphorically, instead of the innovation. The last piece of your question, as I understood it, was, you know, if you do a library in a school and it has 3 computers and 100 kids share it, I don't like that solution, and I think it's a different way of looking at it, but it's, again, a lot better than nothing. So the question is, and this is a question that people would ask me all the time, is should 10 kids share a laptop throughout the whole country, or should 1/10 of the country have 1 laptop per child? And my answer is 1/10 of the country, because then next year we'll do the next 10th, and then next year we'll do the next 10th, and that because of the difference is a better way to go at it. Now, people don't agree with me, and maybe if it's 1 out of 20, does it work? As if it's 1 out of 5, what you can think of your arithmetic, but it's, you know, I'd prefer to do, you know, every one and then take 3 years or 4 years or 5 years to do the whole country. There was one other question here. Yes. You come from Uruguay. Well, thank you. Were you there during the laptop project?
I was here, but I had a family there, and they were sharing stories. And this thing was one of the best things that happened to the family.
Well, it was wonderful to do it there. The president of Uruguay during the time was Tabara Vázquez. And Tabara Vázquez is an oncologist, people show. He's a practicing oncologist. And he told me, I want to have 2 legacies. I want to make Uruguay a no-smoking country, and I want every child to have a laptop. And I thought, my God, if we are in the same thing as making a no-smoking country, which I think is wonderful, and to, you know, have 1 laptop per child, that he was a real pleasure to work with. And what he did, which took an extraordinary amount of courage, is he announced publicly, I will do every child in the country in 18 months. And when he did that, a lot of other people didn't realize the importance. Nobody, no child, no teacher was worried that they wouldn't get a laptop, because it's like electricity, you can't do everybody at once, you got to roll it out. And what happens when most other heads of state, including Peru, made commitments, but schools knew they weren't going to get it. Some were, some weren't. And in Uruguay, because it was every single child, nobody had that problem. Let me see, quick, see if I can go back. There we go. That's Uruguay. And that classroom, and I'll end on this story, is that classroom, the kids are being ecstatic because what's not shown is the president had just walked into the room. Okay, so now this school normally doesn't have the president of the country arriving in the school, so they were ecstatic for the president and so on. But when I went to visit the school, not at the same time he did, afterwards, it was a white building. You'll love this. It's a wonderful architectural ending. It was a white building with a green stripe around the outside of the building. Yeah. 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 Okay, that's a nice place to end.
There is a last question of Irma, but here,
At the beginning, you are an architect.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, what kind of architect you are building now? I mean, you have this program, you have this mission, and what are you building, or it's more about strategy? You said that
Yeah.
if you have to study again, you would choose.
Oh yes, I would study architecture again.
What did you learn that you are not doing?
I'll tell you exactly what I learned when I studied architecture. I learned that problem solving is for sissies, and asking the right questions is for architects. And that, you know, so many of my colleagues take problems and solve them. And I thought, wow, you know, they don't even think if that's the right problem. Whereas architects, if anything, they do the worst. You know, they say, oh no, that's not your problem at all. It's this other thing. But it's a good education. I can't tell if you're a faculty student or what, but stay with it. It's a good thing. Stay with it.
well, thank you.
Yeah. Come up after.